That should do.
Okay, hello everybody. I am Christopher Gauker of the University of Cincinnati. In the other frame is Kathrin Glüer of Stockholm University. And we are going to talk about the contents of perception, in particular whether perceptual representations have propositional contents. Kathrin thinks they do, I think they don't. But before we get started, let me first of all give a shout out to Jonathan Lang and David Kaloran, who invited us to do this session. Thank you for that, Jonathan and David.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Let me give Kathrin a chance to say her name slowly so that everybody in the world who doesn't already know can learn how to say it.
Okay, Kathrin Glüer.
Kathrin Glüer. And I'm Christopher Gauker, or Chris Gauker.
Gauker.
All right, so we're going to talk about whether the contents of perception, in particular whether perceptual representations have propositional content. Kathrin, would you like to start by saying a few words about why you think we should attribute propositional content to perceptual representations?
Yeah, maybe I'll run a quick basic account of perceptual experience by you first, because I suspect that that's actually something we agree on. So would you agree to it if I say that a perceptual experience is a conscious mental state with a representational content and a distinctive phenomenal character?
Well, I would demur at the word content. Representation, yes, but content
yes?
may have the wrong connotations. Something is represented in a perceptual representation.
Okay.
And consciousness might be a problem too, depending on what we mean by that very vexed term. But normally, yes, they're conscious.
Right. How about personal versus subpersonal? Do you agree that they're personal level states that we are talking about?
I've never really understood what that distinction was supposed to be.
Okay.
But we are aware of them, and we can normally report on them, though there may be exceptional cases where we can't report on their presence.
Okay. Right. So there is quite a bit
we talk about them.
Actually agreeing
we talk
on.
about them. We don't have to do. It's not the case that our only access to them is through empirical psychological research.
Right. Right. Good. Yeah. So you already demur at the term content I was using. I think that we should say that perceptual experiences do have representational content, and I also say that they have propositional content. And the way I'm using these terms in these contexts is actually as almost interchangeable. So it's probably good that you're trying to drive the wedge in already at content, because otherwise we might get into trouble seeing what this is all about. And well, I mean, I think that if we talk about states that seem to put some sort of condition on the world, a condition that the world then can either fulfill or not, and we classify these states as veridical or non-veridical, as we tend to do with experiences, now we have at least an intuitive case for saying that we're dealing with something that has content here. So if I look at the scene in front of you, in front of me, I see your face there in the window and so on, then it seems to me that there is a condition associated with this experience that the world can either fulfill or not fulfill. So it seems to me that there is something there that's being represented. So in this very innocent, non-contentious sense of a representational content, I think there is a content there. This content is something that can be evaluated in a certain sort of way. There is a condition for the state to be correct or veridical, or if you want to, there's a truth condition. So that's basically what I would mean by saying there's a propositional content there for.
Well, I agree that perceptions do represent, and that they can represent accurately or inaccurately. But to say that there's a condition that they fulfill is already to suggest that they have propositional content, which I'm doubtful about. And here's why I am doubtful about that. I don't know what words one might choose to express the propositional content of a perceptual representation. Consider this coffee cup. When I look at it, I can describe it in various ways. I can say that it's a chocolate brown coffee cup. I can say that it's a ceramic cylinder. I can say that it's a straight-walled drinking implement with gold printing on it. I can describe it in various ways. And I don't see that any of those ways of saying what I see when I look at the cup can be privileged as the correct expression of the propositional content of my perceptual representation. Now, one might think that one could identify a privileged expression by taking the words that express the propositional content to be words that express maximally determinate properties. So the cup has a certain shape. Let's call the precise shape that this cup has shape 55. We can invent a word for that shape. And then you might think, well, when I go to express the propositional content of my perception and I want to characterize the shape aspect of my perceptual representation, then I can express it using the word shape 55. But I think that that isn't right, because for a thing to be shape 55 is for it to have a backside as well as a front side, and the backside isn't represented in my perceptual representation. So it's not shape 55 that is the property that the propositional content of my perceptual representation would represent. It's the same with respect to color. I might invent a term, brown 97, to express the property that the propositional content, the color property that the propositional content of my perceptual representation is about. But it's not true that my perceptual representation tells me that this is brown 97, because many different neighboring colors might create, under the right lighting circumstances, the very same color experience in me. In posing this problem, I'm of course assuming that if my perceptual representation had a propositional content, then I would be able to find words to express it. That's not to say that the words would have to be words of my current language, but I suppose that through some kind of exercise in language building, we'd be able to introduce vocabulary by which we could express the propositional content of our perceptions, and I think that's a fair assumption. Especially, it's a fair assumption if I'm talking to someone who thinks that we can justify our beliefs by citing the propositional contents of our perceptions.
Right, that was a bunch of arguments as far as I can tell. First, you have the assumption that if there is a propositional content, then we can at least form expressions in a language in which we can communicate that. And I don't think I want to dispute that, at least not right now. So let's go with that for the time being. But then you have, as far as I can make out, two sort of hints at an argument here why that could not be done. And one seems to be that, well, these contents could be expressed in very many different ways, and you give us like 5 examples, and then you say, well, what's the method of picking the right content? Well, for that to be the principled argument against there being propositional contents, I think you would need to show why there can't be a privileged method of getting at the content. I mean, I think most people who think along these lines think that the contents are very, very fine-grained. So if you give me the alternative between it has this, what was it, cylindrical shape, and it has a more specific cylindrical shape, and it has gold print on it, and so on. I mean, my immediate reaction would simply to say, well, it's all in there, since it's all represented in the perception. You can see all of these properties. So, for instance, as long as you don't come up, like, for instance, Travis does, with an argument that says, well, these contents would, for instance, be contradictory or something, I don't really see why we should accept that. Just because there are a couple of candidates, we can say, well, there's no method of picking any kind of privileged content. I mean, everyone who tries to sort of describe what's in the picture, for instance, has to go and use very, very, very many words. So that in itself doesn't seem to me to be any objection to saying that there is a truth condition.
Well, Matt, I'm not trying to prove that there can't be. I'm just asking. You know,
okay.
You say that there is a propositional content. I ask you what it is. You say, if you say, I can't tell you, then I'm going to view your claim with some suspicion. Now, I offered you a a way of distinguishing one kind of expression, namely to choose an expression that speaks only of maximally determinate, fully determinate properties, colors and shapes and so forth. But then I argued that that won't work either, because
that's the other argument. Okay.
because in fact we don't perceive those maximally determinate properties. I would think that if you wanted to say that to my list of characterizations of what I see, all of the above, then you would think that at least there was some sentence that one could speak that comes to an end that implied the rest of those. And I don't know how you would get that unless you thought you could do it by means of a sentence that expressed maximally determinate properties.
I don't see why I would have to accept that the sentence has to come to an end. What do you mean? In real time? I could say it in my lifetime. I don't see why I should accept that. I mean, when I go from the kind of representation that I have in perception to the kind of representation that I give you when I recount the content to you in language, that might simply have this kind of effect that I have to go on for very long. So unless you want to lay down that somehow the conjuncts that that preposition as expressed in language has need to be finite or need to be such that I can speak it within a year or something, I don't think there is much of an argument yet in the offing.
All right, so, well, again, I'm not offering an argument in that sense. I'm asking a question and failing an acceptable answer, drawing conclusions from that. And you certainly don't want to say that everything that I can say in response to the cup, in response to my perception of the cup, is an expression of the propositional content of the perception, right? So if I say that I am looking at a thing that I bought at the University of Wyoming.
No, I don't think that's something you can see.
You don't think the University of Wyoming is, right. So there's a dividing line here. And the question I'm putting back to the person who believes that perceptions have propositional content is how we draw that line. And I don't think it should require empirical research. It should be something you should just be able to say by reflecting on your own perceptual experience. Because,
hold on a second.
Yeah.
Now we're already going into a third argument, right? I mean, should we go to the one about the maximally determinate?
If you think you have an answer to that.
Content.
Sure.
First, well, I don't quite understand what the argument is yet, so I don't know yet whether I have an answer to that or not. But it seemed to me you were saying, like, look, take red 53.
Yeah.
If I would be saying that part of the content of my perceptual experience, now I don't have any red thing here to show you, but that it was that something is of the shade red 53, then you're saying, well, things that are not objectively speaking of that shade, that don't have the color red 53, might look exactly like this thing we are talking about right now. Right. So now we not only have represented properties in the picture, but also the phenomenal character of the experience. So the phenomenal character of an experience, of the red experience here, might be as of shade red 53, even though the object that we're looking at, in fact, does not have that shade. So your challenge seems to be, I mean, first of all, to understand what the challenge is, I need to know why would that be an objection to saying that, nevertheless, what the experience represents is that this object has shade red 53.
I'm supposing that you would agree that the propositional content of the perceptual representation should be readable off of the phenomenal character.
I see. Okay. So the phenomenal character determines the representational content. That's a principle we are assuming here.
Do you agree with that or not?
I agree with that.
Sorry?
I agree with that.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Right. So if different colors, different objective colors could be what's out there when I have an experience with a phenomenal character like this, then that means that the phenomenal character, that the propositional content of the perceptual representation can't pick out one of those colors as over another one.
Yeah, and that's what I'm not quite getting yet. You must have some other assumptions in the background there to get to that conclusion.
Can we talk about shape?
I mean, all representations can misrepresent, right?
What about
if
shape?
I believe that it's red 53, that might be wrong. I nevertheless can believe that. So just that something can look that way and therefore maybe have that content that it's red 53. I mean, that depends on how precisely we think that phenomenal character determines content. It can be in very many different ways.
Well, you could maintain that the perceptual representation doesn't pick out a determinate color, but only a range, including all of those that might, under some circumstance or other, be what's out there when I'm having a perceptual representation with this phenomenal content. But then you're not going with the idea that I proposed, namely that the properties that are the propositional contents of perceptual representations are maximally determinate. We are on that branch of the dilemma where we're supposing that the properties represented are maximally determinate. If you go back to the idea
yes, but I'm still not forced to say that just because this looks like things do that are red 53 in normal conditions or something like that, that every experience that has the phenomenal character as of something red 53 under normal conditions also carries that representational content. I mean, there are phenomena of color constancy that we need to take into account and other things like that. So we haven't sort of settled very much yet in order to see how the phenomenal character determines the representational content. For instance, I think that phenomenal character probably determines representational content intrasubjectively, but not across different subjects for possible inversion reasons and things like that.
So you want to say, even though different objective colors might be what's out there, when I have a perceptual experience having this phenomenal character, one of those colors rather than another might be the one that the propositional content of my perceptual representation is about. For instance, the one that is the cause of a phenomenal perception with a phenomenal character like this under normal conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. Right. And can we talk about shape? So, what is the
shape is more difficult. Colors are nice because we have these nice, clear phenomenal characters there.
Because there are lots of different maybe the shapes that might be what is out there when I'm having a perceptual experience like this one, and the lighting conditions might be normal in every case. But so, for example, take a simpler example. Suppose I was looking at a rectangular piece of wood painted blue. Well, I suppose that if you cut that piece of wood in half and made the bottom half a little larger and moved it back a little bit, then you could create in me, if you held my head still, a visual experience just like the visual experience of looking at an unbroken piece of wood painted blue. Various arrangements of things in space might cause the same perceptual experience in me. So I think for that reason it won't be plausible that the property, this shape property that the propositional content of my perceptual representation picks out is some determinate three-dimensional shape.
I'm still not sure I'm following the argument, because this thing that you have manipulated in parts that don't like appear directly because they are occluded by other parts.
Well, that's how I put it when I was talking about the cup.
Yeah.
Then I changed
so
the
in that
example.
case, I mean, then there is the assumption that the shape that is represented is actually, or that what is represented is actually the shape of the whole object, not just the let's say, directly visible parts. That's something, of course, many people dispute. Some people think that what is primarily represented in perceptual experience is just what's facing you. I'm not completely sure that's true, because I think there are gestalt switches when you sort of, like when you try to watch a facade as if it was a movie facade, right? So you think there is no house behind. That seems to make for a gestalt switch, so a change in phenomenological character. And I think that indicates that actually the backside of the house is represented too. But in the case, I mean, if there isn't a backside, then simply my representation is not veridical in what it is representing about the backside. And I don't see why that's being possible is sort of an argument against them having representational content. I mean, that's one of the virtues of representational contents, that they can be false, right?
Well, I find it very hard to believe that a perceptual representation represents the backside of an object that I don't see. But leave that aside. That
might be the best way of phrasing it.
The virtue of my other example, the block of wood that we could cut in half and move the bottom portion back a little bit and expand, is that in both cases, we could say that the facing surface looks the same to me. That is, the two facing surfaces look the same to me. So if you, even if we allow that what the perceptual representation represents is only the facing surface, we'll still get the result that different facing surfaces might create in me the same perceptual experience.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, different colors can look the same, and so on and so forth. What we need is a principle that determines for us what content is determined by the same phenomenal look. And as long as we don't have such a principle to discuss, we can't say it can't be done. And it seems to me, yeah, I mean, as you know, I want the contents of experiences to contain the looks modality anyway.
Yeah.
So this is more of a problem for the general representationalist who thinks that what is represented is the shape and the color, and not that the thing looks to have a certain color or looks to have a certain shape. Because, I mean, as you can see, I mean, as soon as the looks are the same, you don't create a problem for the what I call looks contents, that is, contents of perceptual experiences that actually contain something like a looks operator.
Right, but you still have to choose a property that follows looks, right? Looks rectangular, looks blue, and I would pose my dilemma about the generality or specificity of the properties represented as one pertaining to the property that you speak of following looks. But you know what?
Yes, but you know, since the look doesn't change by doing that, that's actually not a problem either. These things, these contents that I'm trying to suggest, they are such that you can replace phenomenally equivalent properties.
Okay. Well, for entertainment value, maybe we should move on to a different aspect of this whole issue. I think the viewer will have a sense of our disagreement over my little challenge at this point.
Good.
But another whole aspect here of our question is, well, what's at stake? To put it generally, and I think we agree that part of what's at stake is conception of the epistemic role of perception. So perhaps we should talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we can talk about that. I mean, one other thing I would like to take up, maybe not right now, maybe later, and that is, well, yeah, no, let's just go ahead.
Okay, so you believe that, I'll let you put it your way, that in some way perceptions justify beliefs. And I agree that if we wanted to say that perceptions justify beliefs, then that would be a good reason to ascribe propositional contents to perceptions. But I don't think perceptions justify beliefs. Should I elaborate, or would you like to say why you think perceptions justify beliefs?
I could say a little bit about that.
Sure.
I mean, one thing we need to say up front is that, I mean, there are very many notions of epistemic warrant around. Mm-hmm. Some of them are more externalist than others. Mm-hmm. When I talk about justification here, what I mean is that experiences provide reasons for beliefs, They are things that we cite when we are asked why we form certain very basic beliefs on the basis of perception. We say, well, look, it looked that way, or it sounded that way, or something like that. And that's part of our folk psychological practice of giving reasons. So that, I think, is simply because it is part of that practice. It is a reason-providing role that needs to be captured. There can be other justificatory or warrant-providing relations between perceptions and beliefs that wouldn't be ruled out if this doesn't work, or it wouldn't be ruled out if this works either. But this is one that I think I would like to insist on because it's so entrenched in our folk psychological practices, and therefore I'd like to capture that.
Yeah.
And since these provide by sort of citing states that have propositional content,
Yeah.
like when we do belief reasoning or even in practical reasoning, I think that's something that's worthwhile trying to capture by means of this quasi-inferential way of thinking about reasons that, is sort of part and parcel of the folk psychological tradition of thinking about these things.
I don't accept the datum. I don't really think that we can justify a belief about the observable properties of things by citing their looks. I don't think that it's right to say that if that I can justify to myself my belief that something is green by reminding myself that it looks green. Suppose I'm looking at something, I think it's green, then I begin to question whether it's green because I wonder whether the lighting conditions are normal, suited for detecting the colors of things. I don't think that I can assure myself that it is green by reminding myself that it looks green. Let me say a couple more things about this. We do say, if I ask you, you tell me that there's a chair in the next room, and I ask you why you think there's a chair in the next room, you might say to me, I saw one, or even, it looks like there's one, and I might take that as assurance, but then I think it's because you've informed me that the means by which you've arrived at your belief that the chair in the next room is vision, and I accept the beliefs that you form through vision, whereas I might not accept the beliefs you form on the basis of testimony. If you believe that there's a chair in the room just because someone else told you that, I might not be so disposed to accept what you believe. And certainly one can't just assume that when we say something looks a certain way, that we're reporting the contents of a perceptual representation. I might say that house looks like it was built by Mickey Mouse, but you don't think then that Mickey Mouse is part of the propositional content of my perceptual representation. What I think is that beliefs, or perceptual representations do elicit beliefs, but the entry-level justifiers are the beliefs that perceptions elicit in that way, and not the perceptions themselves.
Yeah, you're with Davidson on that one. But to start answering this again was a huge bunch of arguments. Let's see. So,
well, take the green. Do you think that if I am seeing something, I think that something is green, and then I question it, that I answer some doubt that I might have by telling myself that it looks green?
If I have a reason to question it, no. And I don't think I've said that. I mean, you need to distinguish between providing a reason and providing a good reason. That's the first thing. I think perceptions provide reasons. That doesn't mean that they automatically provide good reasons. I do think they provide pretty strong reasons unless they are defeaters. So this is like the old idea that what we have here is prima facie justification, like Pollock spelled out in the 70s. So if you have a state that sort of tells you it looks green, and there is no defeater in the background, you have no reason to believe that the light is iffy, you have no reason to believe that there is something wrong with your eyes or whatever, then you have a good reason to believe that it's green. As soon as you have a defeater, you'll have to do some weighing. You still have a reason, it looks green, but you also sort of know or believe that this can't be trusted right now, so you'll have to do something else to get more evidence to see what the color really is. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't provide a reason. So, and I mean, it's not just, on my view, if I say it looks green, what I want this to be, as I tried to say before, And that is the content of the first level experiential state. So it's not as if I was hiking myself up onto some second order level where I'm saying, oh, I have this experience, and therefore because I have an experience I should also form the belief or something like that. There's nothing like that. What I think is that there is a first level inferential connection between these two contents that hopefully is secured by the way the world is. So that in the case where I don't have any defeaters around, I can just go and form the belief and be justified in that. I don't think that it's a good idea that at this point to try and invoke any kind of bridge principles that would get me from the experience to the belief, like, oh, and my vision can be trusted right now. That would lead to an infinite regress and therefore can't be used at this point.
But so you don't think that whenever I form a belief to the effect that something is green, I do it by way of first thinking, in time, first thinking, it looks green.
Well, if I form it on the basis of the experience, then I have the state that has that content. I don't have to run through that by thinking.
Would you extend that to, oh, okay, but you don't have to think that. Right. But is it the case that whenever I believe that something is green on the basis of perceptual experience, that my belief is, I don't know if you'll accept the word inference, inferred from the propositional content of the perceptual representation, namely that the thing looks green?
I have not made any claims about actual inferences taking place. I think that it's inferentially supported by your having that experience.
Right.
And then if you want to require, like for personal justification, that it's actually formed on the basis of that or something, you can do that. So far I've only talked about sort of doxastic justification.
I would think that normally the belief that something is green would be formed on the basis of the perceptual experience without it that belief having to have been inferred from, or in any sense derived from or supported by the propositional content of the perceptual representation. And the reason I'm raising the issue is just that I think that if that's so, if the actual process by which the belief is normally formed doesn't go by way of the propositional content of the perceptual representation, then any attempt to justify that belief by citing the way it looks, the fact that it looks green, would have to answer some doubt that I might have about the belief that I'd initially formed. And my objection is that I can't think of any doubt that I might have about whether it's green that I could answer for myself by observing, reminding myself that it looks green.
I don't understand. Why should things not be justified even if no doubt has been raised?
Well, they may be justified, but not in the sense that it's the product of a reliable process, but rather in the sense that it's been I guess I'm assuming that if P is a justification for Q, then P ought to answer some doubt that might be raised about Q. I suppose you reject that assumption.
I mean, if I don't know what color something has, because I haven't seen it yet, I can go and look at it.
Mm-hmm. And I'm supposing you can perceive the color, that is, form the belief that it has the color green, without having to derive that conclusion or infer that conclusion from the propositional from your perceptual representation by virtue of its propositional content.
Yeah, then I'm not sure whether we have any substantive conflict here right now. I mean, I'm not saying that you have to derive it from something that is the perceptual content either. What I'm saying is you have this state, it has a certain perceptual content, you base your belief on it, and that's probably a causal element in this kind of analysis, and there is an inferential connection between the content of the two states, just as you would say, I mean, if I just form a belief on a bunch of basis other beliefs without running through a deliberative process where I sort of run the inference in my head or something. But if the connection between those states is such that one is based on the other, and we have an inferential connection between them, then that seems to me to be sufficient for saying that I'm justified in this way. And it doesn't seem to me that you're actually contradicting that. I mean, except that you don't want the propositional content there in the first place, but...
Well, there are two doubts that I might raise here. One is whether the looks talk is actually expressing the propositional content of a perception.
That's a different issue,
Right.
though.
Right. And my way at that would be what we were talking about before, asking about the terminology. Okay, but
Right.
but I'm letting you have that in order to raise the separate question of whether perceptions justify
That's
beliefs.
what I thought, exactly.
And I'm skeptical because I just don't see how the claim to the effect that something looks F can answer any doubt that I might have about whether it is F.
Yeah, but I mean, if you want to run that, you have to tell me like a bit more precisely what you mean by that it can't answer any doubt. So what is a doubt here? Why is like I don't know what color it is. I go and look. I think I don't have any kinds of reasons to doubt the lights, my eyes, or anything. And I come out of the room again. You ask me, so what color is it? I say it's red. You ask me, why do you think that? Well, I said it looked that way to me. Sounds perfectly fine to me. I mean, we do it all the time
Right.
when we form
Right.
wrong
Right.
beliefs, right? So I come out of the store with this absolutely ugly orange T-shirt, and you say to me, "Why in the world did you buy that?" And I say, "Well, it looked like a real nice red in there."
Right. All right. So to that I say two other things. One is that I do accept your claim about how something looks as a reason to believe what you told me at first, but then I think it's mainly because I've learned from your putting it that way that the means by which you acquired that belief was vision, and that might provide me some assurance. I recognize that your vision is reliable. I also...
Yes, but we're not talking about your justification, we're talking about mine.
Right, but you were appealing...
And I'm saying I'm reporting my reason for thinking that it's
Right.
red to you when I say it looked that way.
Right, but in trying to persuade me that the claim about how things look is a justification, you were telling the story in which you thought that I would evidently accept it as a reason to believe that the object was orange. And I'm explaining why I can agree that I would accept that as a reason to accept the belief you initially declared, without conceding that the perceptual content, the perceptual representation by virtue of its content is justifying the belief that you cite.
Yes, but the point of the story was not to get you to say, okay, in that case you would accept that it's
Okay.
green. I mean, we're not talking about your reasons. I want to know
Right.
why don't you accept the claim that it's my reason
Because
for my belief?
because I don't know what doubt it might answer. So I can imagine, I can think of circumstances in which I might doubt my initial assumption that something was green. Namely, I might begin to doubt the lighting conditions or my sense organs or something like that. But none of those doubts would be answered by reminding myself that it does
because
look
they
green.
all would be defeaters. So if we are in a situation where all doubts are valid defeaters.
Okay. Well, I don't say doubts are defeaters. I mean, a doubt can be answered. Defeat is a success word. The doubts may be prima facie defeaters, but not necessarily defeat anything. I've lost track of I've lost track.
Okay, my claim was that if you have a perceptual experience, then that provides you with prima facie reason
Right.
for believing that
Right.
things are as they seem,
Right.
let's
Right.
say.
Right.
And prima facie here means
Right.
there are no defeaters overriding the
Right.
evidence
Right.
provided by your senses.
Right.
I mean, you might have a very weak idea that, okay, maybe there is these weird scientists that have done something to the sun, so maybe colors aren't as they... But really, I don't allow that to defeat my... So not all defeaters actually override the perceptual evidence, I think.
Right.
And to that extent, we can say that, well, in that case, that kind of doubt that you are raising can be answered, namely when it doesn't have defeating power.
I guess my problem is I'm just not feeling the force of the justification. It looks green. Beyond recognizing that it tells me that the speaker is is forming beliefs about the color on the basis of vision. Should we see whether there are other topics that we should touch on?
Yeah, but maybe you want to sort of come out and say how radical this doubt of yours about the justificatory power of experience is. I mean, do you think we can tell any kind of justificatory story about the transition from perceptions to beliefs, or is it merely a causal story that we can tell?
Neither. I do believe that perceptual representations may be accurate or inaccurate, and that the representational character of a perceptual representation has a bearing on what beliefs it is correct to form in response to that perceptual representation. But that doesn't mean that the perceptual representation has a propositional content that we can cite in justification. Rather, it means that we can explain error and success by citing the representational character of the perceptual representation. We might explain that a basketball player missed the shot because he misperceived the distance between himself and the basket. Or we may explain why a runner began her sprint to the finish too soon because she misperceived the distance between herself and the finish line. And we might explain cases of success in forming beliefs by citing the accuracy of the perceptual representations on which those beliefs were formed. So this takes us to another issue that I would like to say something about, namely the accuracy of perceptual representations.
Yes, but let me edge in one more question at that point before we go to the more fundamental question. So the basketball player that misjudges the distance.
Yes.
He forms the belief that the basket, let's say, is at a certain distance from himself on the basis of perception. Is that belief justified or not?
It may be justified or not, but not in the sense of being justified by some premise-like proposition-bearing mental state. As you know, there's also just being justified in the sense of forming a belief by means of a reliable process. And so, if the belief is elicited by a inaccurate perceptual representation, then I think that probably we'd end up saying that that belief was not formed by means of a reliable process, and so was unjustified. But not in this particular sense.
But the representational character. It's representing, let's say, the basket as closer than it really is, does play a role in characterizing this process now as unreliable, right? Well, so the reliability or not has something to do with the representational character and the representational information, or whatever you might want to call it, carried by the antecedent state. And that makes me very, very skeptical towards the claim that these guys don't have representational or propositional content. So that's what we should talk about now.
But I won't characterize it. I won't characterize the perception in terms of its information, the information it carries, and I won't say that it represents the basket as being a certain distance away. That's already, both those locutions are ways of ascribing propositional content to the perception.
But it's inaccurate in a certain sense.
Yes. All right.
Yes.
So maybe I should say
in what sense?
That. All right.
Yes.
So I suppose that objects and scenarios can be thought of as occupying locations in an objective quality space. Dimensions of the objective quality space might be dimensions of color, dimensions of size, others that less readily come to mind, such as jerkiness of motion. The motion of a squirrel is jerkier than the motion of a cat. And objects and scenarios have locations in this many-dimensional objective quality space. Each mind contains a perceptual similarity space. Points or marks in that perceptual similarity space represent locations in objective quality space. And we have to draw a distinction between the point in objective quality space that an object or scenario is actually at and the point in objective quality space that the mark that represents it in perceptual similarity space is mapped into. Inasmuch as there may be a disparity between the point that the object or scenario is actually at and the point that its mark is mapped into, there may be inaccuracy. That mapping between, now what has to be explained is what that mapping is between points and marks in perceptual similarity space and points in objective quality space. And that I would explain in terms of biological function. I'm supposing that there's a biologically normal way for this perceptual similarity space and the marks therein to drive behavior, and there will be a biologically normal way for marks to be laid down in perceptual similarity space representing objects and scenarios. And so the point in objective quality space that a mark in perceptual similarity space is mapped into is the point in objective quality space where the object or scenario would actually be if the mark representing it had been laid down in the biologically normal way. So there's a representation relation between marks in perceptual similarity space and points in objective quality space.
Right, and the talk about the function is supposed to give us sort of the
mapping
measure for where it's inaccurate and where it's
well, the measure of inaccuracy is the distance between where in objective quality space the object or scenario actually is and the point that its record is mapped into. Okay. The mapping is defined in terms of biological function.
Right.
So if I
Sure.
if I don't get a good look at a thing and quickly record its location in perceptual similarity space, but don't do so in the biologically normal way, the point in objective quality space that I perceptually represented it as being in may not be the point in objective quality space where it actually is, and then that perceptual representation is a misrepresentation, is inaccurate to that extent.
Okay.
So then I'll appeal.
Of course, that makes the question. I mean, we can think of this sounds like somewhat similar to thinking of perceptual representations as map-like, except that you have very many dimensions in your space. So what prevents someone like me who thinks of propositions in such a very innocent and non-controversial sense as saying, well, look what your perceptual similarity space there does. That's a sort of medium of representation that's tailored to perception. But what it does, it puts a condition on the world to be accurate or inaccurate. So why doesn't this carry a propositional content?
Well, you might say that the propositional content of a perception is a proposition that specifies the location in objective quality space of the point that the perceptual representation is mapped into. But that won't be what you're thinking of when you say that perceptions have propositional content, because there's no assumption that the perceiver should be able to express that proposition in words. It is an empirical question what the dimensions of perceptual similarity space are, and we're not going to know what they are, without doing empirical research, without doing psychological research. So this kind of proposition will not meet my expectation that the propositional content of a perception, if perceptions had propositional contents, should be expressible in words without our having to do psychological experiments on ourselves. And you wouldn't be able to cite this kind of proposition in justification of any other belief. So it wouldn't be the case that if you asked me, why do you think that that object is cylindrical, that I could then say, well, it's because my perceptual representation represents it as occupying such and such point in objective quality space. You wouldn't talk that way.
No, sure. I don't usually talk about the media of representation that my mental states employ. I mean, I don't talk about my language of thought, let's say there is one, either when I give the contents of my beliefs to you, right? But I try to render in natural language exactly the same condition that this other medium of representation also carries. So,
So I misspoke. I should have said. So you're entertaining the idea that on my theory there's a proposition which specifies the location of a thing in objective quality space, and so what I should have said was, well, that's not the kind of propositional content that we were talking about before, because we wouldn't expect that a person would be able to justify a belief by citing the location of the object of perception in objective quality space. I made a mistake earlier in explaining why this kind of propositional content would not be the kind of propositional content you were looking for by characterizing it as a proposition about marks in perceptual similarity space, and I shouldn't have done that.
You shouldn't have done that. Okay. I'm still not sure why, I mean, whether we can express it and whether we cite it or not. I mean, these seems to me are desiderata that develop from the kind of state that we are talking about here. We're talking about perceptual experience. This is where sort of we came in. These experiences are such that they are conscious in some sense, that we maybe can agree on or not, that they are personal level states, that their character is accessible to the subject, and so on. Now you're saying, okay, these guys do carry some kind of representation, nil whatever,
yeah.
if you don't want to call it content, but that content is actually not accessible to me. And in that case, I don't really see why I should accept that claim. I mean, either you're not talking about the states anymore that we tried to talk about at the beginning, or else you'll have to sort of bring up the evidence for that actually the representational properties of these states are not accessible to normal human subjects in any way.
Well, when I granted that the perceptual representations were personal level, what I meant to say was that, what I meant to concede was that they are introspectable. I don't believe in the mind's eye, but we do have the capacity to think about our own mental states, and I can describe my perceptual representation as the kind of perceptual representation a person has when looking at a coffee cup, for example. I am aware of my having a perceptual representation of that kind, but I don't then concede that there is a coffee cup in front of me or anything like that is the propositional content of the perceptual representation.
And you also think that these, I don't know what to call them, locations in objective quality space.
Yeah.
They don't sort of correspond closely to objects actually having these properties. I mean, if what is represented by your phenomenal property space is a certain position in objective property space, it would seem to me that the position in objective property space translate very directly into, for instance, those worlds in which that object has precisely those properties or something.
Right.
So it seems to me there's a very classical representation relation here, which can be captured, for instance, by means of possible worlds propositions or something.
I concede that, but
those
won't be the propositions that you're thinking of when you say that perceptual representations have propositional content, because again, those propositions will not meet my expectation that the propositional content of perceptual representations that we might cite in justification are propositional contents that we could, without doing empirical research on ourselves, express in words.
Yeah, I find it very hard to see why you're saying that. I guess you think that there is some empirical evidence backing that claim, but we would have to look at that before I could make any kind of assessment of that. So to me it seems like, okay, if I look at that coffee cup and whatever I think of translations into objective quality spaces and perceptual similarity spaces and whatever, there will be something I can report to you that has a lot to do with precisely those objective qualities, namely the color and the shape and lots and lots of things that I can get very specific about if I care.
And the dimensions of objective quality space, I don't know that I said this, but let me say it now, are dimensions of objective variation that we are able to detect perceptually. And I think that's an empirical question,
Right.
what those are. So we would not be able to express this propositional content in the way that would be required if we were to think of that propositional content as a justifier for other beliefs.
So you're saying the prediction that the dimensions that we are actually sensitive to could turn out to be completely different from color, shape, distance,
I presume
and classical sensible properties.
I presume those, actually there'll be many dimensions for color, hue, and brightness and so forth, but I think
yes,
those aren't nearly enough. So for example, it might include jerkiness of motion, or when we're, in order to perceive an arrangement of objects, we might have to have a dimension that measures degree of congruence to a certain triangle. Which dimensions of objective variation our perceptual apparatus is actually sensitive to will be an empirical question.
Well, in that case, of course, now we would have to go into a discussion about what's empirical and what's not, and whether the assumption that beliefs, for instance, have contents, or utterances, linguistic utterances, have contents that do not have this very kind of variation that we can know quite a lot a priori, and something needs to be investigated empirically. I mean, I think you're drawing a contrast there that I don't think is justified, but we would need to look at that.
So the bottom line
in more details some other time, I guess.
We don't know, apart from doing sophisticated empirical work that we haven't done, what the dimensions of objective quality space are. So we can't just report them. May I add, just throw in one thing for people who are listening, and that I want to clarify. What I have said about perceptual representation so far will not handle the case of what I call persistent illusions, like the Muller-Lyer arrows. To define the sense in which our perception of the Muller-Lyer arrows is inaccurate, something else has to be said that I didn't say yet, because one might suppose that our perceptual representations of the Muller-Lyer arrows are, despite their misleading character, recorded in the functionally normal way. I just want people to know that. Okay, so what else should we talk about?
I don't know. I think we have exhausted our list now.
Okay, should we wrap it up?
Yep.
All right, thank you very much. See you on Philosophy TV.